Have you ever felt your solos sound more like exercises than real music? That was never the case for Joe Walsh, and we'll see why when we compare him to Don Felder in one of rock's most iconic solos ever. In this video, I'll walk you through what each of them did and compare their styles. It's an easy idea anyone can use, and it'll give your solos more life and expression than any scale exercise ever could. Let's do this. I love Joe Walsh's guitar playing, and I'm not alone. Pete Townsend, Jimmy Page, and even Slash praised his style. Joe Walsh had already made his mark before joining the Eagles, first with the James Gang, where his raw blues rock style and vocal-like phrasing really stood out, and then with Barnstorm and in his solo records. His strength wasn't flashy technique, but rather it was making every bend, every slide, every phrase come alive. When he joined the Eagles in 1975, his style meshed with Don Felder's more melodic, polished approach, and nowhere does that contrast make itself more clear than on Hotel California. Now, before we get into it, I want to clear something up that's often repeated, that Don Felder not only wrote the music, but wrote Joe's solo note for note as well, and that's not true. Don Felder did write the chord progression and came up with the twin guitar concept, but when it came to the solos, each guitarist wrote his own part, did his own part. Walsh himself has said in an interview with Daniel Griffiths of Music Radar that the solos were not planned, they were spontaneous, playing off of each other. So it makes sense to use this song to contrast their two solo styles. But Hotel California's chord progression has some surprises in it, and it's the backbone of the framework for how each player is going to approach the solo. So let's look at that first. It's important. The solo doesn't happen over a typical blues or rock progression. Instead, it's built on a repeating 8-chord cycle: B minor, F sharp, A, E, G, D, E minor, and then back to F sharp, and then it turns back on itself. Now, at first you might think, okay, B minor or D major, that's the key. But not all of these chords fit neatly inside that box. For example, the F sharp has an A sharp in it, which doesn't fit into the B minor scale. And likewise, E has a G sharp in it, which also doesn't quite fit into that B minor scale. Right here, where we go into the G and the D, it gives it more of a D major flavor. All those things make up part of why the solo feels so compelling. It's constantly shifting the ground underneath the guitarist's feet. And woven into this sequence is a line cliche, a descending voice that pulls step by step through the chords. That descending motion is hypnotic. It gives the whole progression a sense of inevitability, like it's always moving forward. For a guitarist, this is important, and it shows why solos are not just scale patterns. Now, we can use the B minor scale or the B minor pentatonic scale as a framework, but we can't only do that. The harmony is far too rich, and we would lose the thread of the song if we did that. But what's cool is that Walsh and Felder play so differently across these same chords, and that's what makes the interplay so interesting and fun, and also instructive. Let me show you. First, this is very important. The phrasing that each player uses is 2-bar phrasing. That means we're going to look at the phrase over 2-bar chunks, like, for example, B minor and F sharp. It's the same way the vocalist sings it. So let's take a look at that first phrase, that B minor to F sharp. First, here's Don Felder. Now, Don came from a background steeped in melody and structure, and his solos often feel composed. You hear a lot of chord outlining, arpeggios, and really carefully placed notes. For example, that last note, that A sharp, does not appear in the B minor or B minor pentatonic scales. However, it does appear F sharp chord. It's the third of that chord. Felder lands on it, gives it extra emphasis. Now here's what Joe did over that same phrase, B minor to F sharp. He brings a raw blues rock voice into this. Now he wasn't worried about polish, he was after feel. He does tend to use the B minor pentatonic on this. However, he ends it on this note, an F sharp, which is the root of that F sharp chord. In other words, a chord tone. Now, Don Felder went for the third of that chord. A little more subtle going for the third. Joe goes right for the jugular, hits the root on it. Now let's have a look at how each player played the second line, the A chord to the E chord. First, Don Felder. So smooth and melodic. Note that he is bending to a chord tone at the end. Bending to this note, a G sharp, which is the third of E, our landing chord. You know, one thing that's tough about chord tones in rock is that you're often bending to those chord tones, and Felder does it to perfection. Now here's Joe Walsh over that same A to E. Such a cool line. And it's such a contrast to Felder's really precise outlining of chords. He's not doing that at all. The first bend just is crying out. And then real blues rock phrasing. And then his signature chromatic line. That's so cool. And where does he end? He ends on that G sharp, which is a chord tone of E. It's the third. It's not in that B minor pentatonic scale, although he's basically using that scale as a framework. He understands he needs to go outside the scale to get that tone. Very cool. By the way, if you want to see those chords and therefore chord tones more easily, you can get my free Triad roadmap by clicking on the link in the description. All right, now let's look at that G to D transition, the two-bar phrase. First, again, Don Felder. Here's Felder. The first part outlines a G chord. And the second part, this country thing, really just outlines a D chord. Landing on a D note over a D chord, chord tones. Now here's Joe over that G to D sequence. So cool. Again, Joe is taking a more rock-like approach using B minor pentatonic or D major pentatonic. They both share the same notes, so it's okay to use either framework. And the BB box. And then that chromatic line that's so characteristic of him. Complete with a string grab on the first and second string. But again, ending on that chord tone, that D there, over the D chord. So a pattern has emerged. Don tends to outline chords, while Joe takes a more rock and roll approach, using a scale, but being mindful of the chords and being willing to grab a chord tone outside the scale when he needs to. Now, did he do this by ear? Probably, but I guarantee you he knew the chord progression. And if you're developing your ear and your intuition, it's important that you know why certain special notes sound, well, special. All right, now let's do line 4, that E minor back to the F sharp. Here's Don. See, Don can play pentatonic licks too, but that ending note, an F sharp, you better believe that's a chord tone, the root of the F sharp chord. And here's what Joe played over that E minor to F sharp sequence. That gets us to the F sharp, and then he even played to the B minor by doing that. Now, again, he plays like a blues rock player, stays in that same register, and leaves a ton of space all over the place. Ends on that F sharp over the F sharp, and then to get back to the B minor, he bends to the B. Couldn't be any more hitting a chord tone than hitting the root. So Felder shows us how to think like a composer, and Walsh shows us how to play like a singer with a guitar in his hands. Both approaches work, and together they're magic. But if you want to learn a super simple Joe Walsh trick that you can add into your playing in just 5 minutes, click here. It's something that not only Joe Walsh did, but all the greats did. Jimmy Page, Duane Allman, Freddie King. So click here, check it out, and I'll see you in the next video. See you on down the road.